I am 𝓥𝓲𝓫𝓱𝓪 and welcome to 𝓥𝓲𝓫𝓱𝓪 classes 𝓥𝓲𝓫𝓱𝓪. In this video, I will explain Class 12 Political Science Chapter 4, which is India's External Relations. Now, in the first 3 chapters of this book, we have focused on the internal challenges, on the domestic development of the country. In this chapter, as the name of this chapter suggests, we will study about the external challenges that India faced as a newly independent nation. We will discuss about the foreign policy that India adopted immediately after independence, discuss about the non-alignment movement as well, how India faced the international challenges, the external challenges after the independence. We will also discuss about the wars that were fought with China and Pakistan in 1965, 1971 and in 1962. We will discuss about the conflicting situations with our neighbors such as Pakistan and China. So basically what we will be studying in this chapter is going to be the formulation of the foreign policy of India immediately after independence. And for any foreign policy to be formulated, there are many factors. So we'll study about the international context as well. We'll discuss about our relations with China and Pakistan as well, the evolution of India's nuclear policy as well. So these will be the major points of discussion in this chapter. And without any further ado, let's get started with the first topic, which is international context. Now, as you know that for any individual, for any family or for any country, there are 2 factors which influence their personality or their policies. First is the internal factor and second are the external factors. Talking about the international context, when India got independence, you know that in 1945 the Second World War had ended and it had left devastating impact on many countries. So it was a time of reconstruction of economy, of military for many countries such as Japan, such as Germany. So we can say that after the Second World War, at the time of independence of India, there was reconstruction going on in many countries. Secondly, as you know that at that time the British Empire was very much weakened and many such colonial powers were weakened. So it was also a time of collapse of colonialism. Not just India, but from the period of 1940s to 1950s, many other countries, many other colonial countries had been given independence as well. So we can say that it was a time of collapse of colonialism, and if there is collapse of colonialism, that means that there will be many newly independent nations. And those newly independent nations were facing the twin challenges. Talking about the twin challenges is meant the challenges of welfare and democracy in the country, because for a newly independent nation it was very hard to establish democracy, at the same time promote the rapid economic development. So seeing all that international context, the India's main focus in the foreign policy was to maintain peace, was to maintain the sovereignty and the peace of the country. Why so? Because there were many reasons. First of all, many new countries, many newly independent nations at that time did not have resources to have their support in the international forum. They could not ask for so many demands in the international system due to lack of resources, and many a times these countries were having dependence for their economic growth, for their military growth on many bigger countries, and their foreign policy was influenced by the policies of those bigger countries. So we can say that due to having dependence on such larger economies, many countries' foreign policies were influenced, and you will study about this in the next book of this class as well, which is talking about the world politics. In that book, in the first chapter, we will study about the Cold War era. As I just said that many countries were having dependence, and this led to the division in the whole world into 2 blocks. First, which was led by the United States, and second, which was led by the then Soviet Union. So what did India choose? India chose non-alignment. Now what is non-alignment? We will study later in this chapter. So we can say that At the time of independence, immediately after independence, the international context was very much, we can say, very much in turmoil, very much chaotic because of having two blocks, because of the Cold War era, and it was very hard to deal with it. So how did India deal with it? Let's discuss that with the next topic, which is the policy of non-alignment. So the policy of non-alignment. Now before discussing what is the policy of non-alignment, let's discuss about how it came into practice. As you know that there were external and internal factors which influence India's foreign policy. We have already discussed about the international context, but what about the internal factors? The internal factors was, of course, the biggest one was the India's freedom struggle, and not just India's freedom struggle, because the freedom struggle of India was not an isolated process. It was a part of the worldwide struggle against colonialism and imperialism, because not just India, many other Asian and African countries were fighting for their independence. There were many contacts between the Indian leaders and many other colonial leaders who were a part of the colonies due to colonial powers prior to the independence, between the Indian and African leaders, between the Indian and other Asian leaders. So we can say that, and one of the biggest examples is the establishment of the Indian National Army by Subhash Chandra Bose, which was a manifestation of the linkages between the Indian citizens and the overseas Indians. We could see that there were linkages between the Indians and the foreign people even prior to the independence, because the freedom struggle was not at all an isolated process. After that, because the independence of India coincided with the beginning of the Cold War era, and the time of Cold War was a time of military confrontation, was a time of social confrontation. There were many confrontations between the two blocks which were led by the US and the USSR, and they were the major two superpowers of that time. So what exactly was Cold War? To be in simple language, it was a kind of not exact proxy war, not just physical war, it was more of the silent war, because there is a saying in English which we say that in an area there can only be one king, there can only be one winner. That was the type of situation that was happening at that time, because there were two major superpowers. One was US and second was the USSR. So of course they could not see each other being more powerful, and that is why they made blocks. Many countries were supporting the bloc led by the US, many countries were supporting the bloc led by the USSR. So what about India's stand? India of course chose non-alignment. Non-alignment, as the name suggests, it was a type of a policy which was adopted by India, not just India, many other countries, which kept distance from both of the camps. We'll study about in detail later as well. Now here in the formulation of the foreign policy, there was a major role of our Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru. So what was Nehru's role? Now you know that from the period of 1946 to 1964, the time period when Jawaharlal Nehru was the Prime Minister of our country, he was also the Foreign Minister of the country, and that is why he had great power in formulating the foreign policy. At the time of independence, of course, he chose a non-alignment. He did not want to be a part of any of the blocs led by the US and the USSR. However, many Indian political groups and leaders disagreed with him. Why? Because the US-led bloc claimed to be pro-democratic, and that is why leaders such as B.R. Ambedkar and parties such as Swatantra Party and the Bharatiya Jana Sangh, which were opposed to communism, had a keen thinking, had a keen leaning towards the bloc led by the US. So of course they were kind of disagreement with the policy chosen by Jawaharlal Nehru, but we can say that Jawaharlal Nehru had a great leeway in formulating the foreign policy, and that is why from period of 1946 to 1964 he had formulated the major foreign policies of our country. Nehru's main agenda in formulating the foreign policy or the external relation policy were 3 points. First was to preserve the hard-earned sovereignty of our country. Second was to protect the territorial integrity of our country. Third was to maintain peace, to respect others' choice as well, and the rapid economic development of our country. Of course, if there is so much peace and maintenance of all law and order, but if there is no economic development, then how would the country go on? So there were main 3 points in the Nehru's foreign policy. First was to protect the sovereignty, second was to protect the territorial integrity, and the third was to have rapid economic growth in the country, because at that time there were many things going on in the world. There was the Cold War era, then the emergence of communist China. As you already know that Chinese Communist Party at that time rose up. There were leaders such as Mao Zedong who were having control in China. So of course China emerged as a communist China as well. So of course there were many things going on in the international, at the global level, and that is why it was very important to formulate a foreign policy which was balanced and not tilted towards any of the blocks. And how was it formulated? Let's discuss with the next topic, which is distance from two camps. So distance from two camps. Now let's discuss about the non-alignment movement. Now Indian foreign policy, Nehru's foreign policy, vigorously pursued the dream of a peaceful world by advocating the policy of non-alignment, by contributing resources to the operations of the UN for keeping peace in the world, and by reducing the Cold War tensions as well, which were due to military confrontation. So we can say that Nehru really advocated a lot the idea of non-alignment. There was a Bandhan conference in 1955 which is seen as the foundation of non-alignment. There were some five core founding members of non-alignment movement. One was India, second was Indonesia, third was Egypt, fourth was Ghana, and fifth was Yugoslavia. As you know that later on Yugoslavia split into 6-7 countries, and before splitting it was a founding member of the non-alignment movement. So what exactly was non-alignment? It meant that India was not a part of any of the camps or the blocs led by the US and the USSR. It wanted to keep a balancing act between the two blocs. Why so? Because there were many military alliances. As you will study in the world politics book, NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which was initiated by the US, and Warsaw Pact, which was initiated by the Soviet Union, were a clear sign of the military confrontation. So we can say that India did not want to be a part of any of the military confrontation, and that is why it wanted to keep a balancing act between the two blocs led by the US and the USSR. However, many times it was said that many critics came up that sometimes the balance was not seen between India and the two blocs. Why so? Because in 1956, when Britain attacked Egypt over the issue of Suez Canal, India joined the public protest, the world protest against this neo-colonial invasion. But later, when in the same year USSR invaded Hungary, at that time India was not a part of the public condemnation. So we can say that sometimes the balance did not appear. However, overall India succeeded in keeping the balanced act between the US and the USSR at the time of Cold War era. And not just India, many other founding members of the non-alignment movement, or in short NAM, also succeeded in keeping a balancing act, because they were just a newly independent nations. Of course, they could not afford confrontation with such large superpowers, and that's why they wanted to keep peace. Talking about Pakistan, our neighbor, it joined the US-led military alliances, and you know that at the time of independence, immediately after independence, the United States was not very happy with the choices of India. It resented the independence choices, independent economic development of India, and that is why sometimes it was seen that US openly resented the India's choices. However, overall saying, we can say that India kept a balancing peaceful act between the two blocs, and it advocated the non-alignment movement to other countries as well, and that is why later on many other countries became members of that movement as well. Another thing was the Afro-Asian unity. Now what was this? Not just non-alignment movement. Other than that, Nehru at the time of independence, prior to independence and immediately after independence, envisaged a greater unity of Afro-Asian countries. He envisaged a great role of India in Asia's affairs. We can say that at that time Nehru was a prominent leader, not just in India but in many other Asian and African countries as well. A good example of this could be seen in 1947. 5 months prior to our independence, in March, there was a conference which was for the Asian countries conference. Now that conference marked a prominent role in the popularity of Nehru, because it was a very big conference which was held before independence. After that, in 1955, the Bandung Conference in Indonesia was held, which was seen as a foundation of the non-alignment movement. In that Bandung Conference, there were 5 countries, the foundation members, and other countries. Other than that, we also see that Nehru at that time had a great role in declaring the Afro-Asian unity. Why so? Because in 1949, when the Dutch colonial regime was being suppressed, was being protested against by Indonesian protest, because Indonesia was being ruled by the Dutch regime. So there were many public protests going on for the independence of Indonesia, and India supported that thing. India supported that protest because, of course, any colonialism, any colonial, you could say imperialism or colonialism is wrong. So, of course, to protect the sovereignty and independence of the country, India supported that protest. India also opposed racism and apartheid system in South Africa. So, we can say that in Asian as well as in African nation, both had a very great leaning towards Nehru's role. Other than that, let's discuss about the next topic, which is peace and conflicts with China. So peace and conflicts with China. Now, as you know that in 1949, China emerged as a communist China, and India at that time was one of the first nations to recognize a communist government in China. In 11th class, you have already studied about the Communist Party of China and about the leader Mao Zedong. So they were the ones who established the communism, the communist China at that time. Now, Nehru at that time said a statement which was that it was exceedingly unlikely that China will in future have attack on India. Now, many of his colleagues such as Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel were opposed to this statement, because you know that there were two kinds of statements. Nehru's vision was idealistic, while Vallabhbhai Patel's vision was practical, because we have already seen that in the world, the socialism, the communist governments are always aggressive in nature, and that is why Patel feared that China in the future would have an aggression towards India, and Nehru in his statement said that it was exceedingly unlikely. Another fact was that after that, in 1954, on 29th April 1954, the Panchshil Agreement was signed between India and China, where there were many clauses about respecting territorial integrity, about being in peaceful aggression. There were many provisions, there were many clauses of the Panchshil Agreement which further strengthened the relations between India and China. So we can say that in the starting phase of course there were mutual respect between the two countries. But what happened in the near coming time? It was just opposite of what people had thought. Now the main aggression firstly was the region of Tibet. Now Tibet is the Central Asian plateaus, Tibetan plateaus, which from the historical time, from time to time have been independent, and from the time to time has been under the control of China. In 1950, the Chinese government took control of Tibetan region, took complete control of Tibet region. Now that marked some tensions between China and Tibet, because Tibetans were saying that their autonomy was not granted, they should have been independent. Now India also supported this. What happened after the signing of Panchshir agreement? India had to concede China's claim over Tibet, because one of the clauses of Panchshir agreement was that they would, both the countries, India and China, would respect the territorial integrity and boundaries of each other. So of course India had to concede with that. And in 1956, when the Chinese premier Zhou Enlai, who was the one who signed the Panchshir agreement, you know that Panchshir agreement was signed between the Indian Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru and the Chinese premier Zhou Enlai. So Zhou Enlai had a visit in India in 1956, and at that time the spiritual leader of Tibetans, who was Dalai Lama, also accompanied him. He accompanied him to inform Nehru about the worsening conditions in Tibet. He also said that their autonomy was taken, they were not given freedom. There were many statements that he said about the worsening situations in Tibet. And you know that when the Panchshir agreement was signed between India and China in Hindi in India, there were many kind of you can say many statements that were said by the people, such as Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai, which means that Indians and Chinese were brothers. So we can say that at that time when the Panchshir agreement was signed, the relationship of course strengthened, but it over the time was very much in turmoil. First was of course the Tibet. When Dalai Lama accompanied Zhou Enlai, he informed Nehru about the worsening conditions in Tibet. Then Nehru confronted Zhou Enlai about this, and Zhou Enlai assured, the China assured that in the coming time Tibet will have the greatest autonomy compared to any other Chinese region ever. And what happened? It did not ever happen, because there were many kind of turmoil, many protests that were uprising in Tibetan regions, and they were forcefully suppressed by the Chinese armed forces. And due to this, when Dalai Lama saw the situation of Tibet in 1959, he came to India by crossing the boundaries and took asylum in India, which India also gave. Over the years, you know that not just in India but in many other countries, Tibetans have sought refuge. Perhaps the biggest refugee center in India is 𝓥𝓲𝓫 in Himachal Pradesh. Mostly in Delhi and in Himachal Pradesh region, there are many refugee centers for the Tibetans. So we can say that in 1959, Dalai Lama crossed boundaries because he already predicted that there would be great turmoil in Tibetan region, and that's why it was very important that he took asylum in India. Now that led to more tensions between India and China. Over the years, it also confronted the relations between India and China, because Chinese government saw it as a promotion of anti-Chinese activities from within India. Second tension, the second reason for tensions between India and China, let's discuss with the next topic, which is the Chinese invasion 1962. Now the second reason was of the boundaries. Why so? You know that India and China have been divided with the line of actual control, which was decided during the British colonial rule, and India had accepted it, but the Chinese government was not accepting it. It stated that any boundary decision made in the colonial era shall not be accepted, and that is why many boundary tensions came up between India and China. The Chinese government claimed the region of Aksai Chin in Ladakh region and the Nepha region. Now presently it's said that it's called Arunachal Pradesh, but at that time it was called Nepha, Northeastern Frontier Agency. So Northeastern Frontier Agency and Aksai Chin were claimed by China, and that is why it led to tensions between India and China. And even with the top experts who were great experts in this field of military confrontation, these boundary skirmishes could not be resolved, and that is why in 1962, when whole world's attention was in the Cuban Missile Crisis, China invaded India. China had an attack in India in October 1962. So we can say that it landed a great and massive attack on India in 1962 in the month of October. The first attack was in the region of Arunachal Pradesh, then called Nepha, which lasted for a week, and the second attack was a month later. Now, what did India do in its defense? Now, in the region of Aksai Chin, India had great defense. It could prevent the invasion of China. But in the region of Arunachal Pradesh, it had a lot of territories. The Chinese military forces had even come to the region of Assam, and from then on it had a unilateral ceasefire and went back to the region where it was before invasion. So we can say that it was the time when India lost that war, and for this Jawaharlal Nehru was very much condemned by the public. Why so? Because it was said that it was his naive assessment of Chinese government. It was his naive assessment of the China's aggressive nature, because his view were more on idealistic nature of China rather than on the practical nature of China. Another thing, it was also a moment of you could say national humiliation and a moment of spirit of nationalism. Why? Because India had to take help, had to take military assistance from the British forces and the American forces, because India did not have that much bigger military compared to China at that time. So we could say that at that time we had to take military assistance, and that is why it became a moment of national humiliation as well. Many people lost their lives. India had a lot of casualty as well, and that is why there were many consequences on India. So we can say that this Indo-China War, the Sino-Indian War of 1962, was a moment of great humiliation for India, a very sad and disheartened moment for India. So we can say that the Sino-Indian War of 1962 had a very bad impact. The government of Jawaharlal Nehru was criticized for this, and for the first time a no confidence motion was stood up against him. And after that, in many of the by-elections in the country, Congress lost its support because of this war. So we can say that it had a very bad impact on the political career of Congress party as well, because of course it was their wrong choice. It could be considered a lack of assessment, a lack of practical or concrete assessment, and that is why they had to face the consequences. And not just the ruling party, even the opposition parties were affected, were influenced by this war. For example, you know about the Communist Party of India, which was split in 1964. Now with the emergence of Communist China, there was a faction that developed in the Communist Party, and finally in 1964 they had to split. The pro-Soviet faction remained as the main party, which was the Communist Party of India, and the faction which supported the ideologies of Chinese communism, it was formed as another party in 1964, which was Communist Party of India, Marxism. And later on, with the attack of China after the war, many of the leaders of Communist Party of India, Marxism, which supported the ideas of China, were arrested as well. Another thing, the CPI, which was the main party, the pro-Soviet Union party, was more in the linkage with Congress. It had many attachments with the Congress party, while the Communist Party of India, Marxism, was completely opposed to linkaging with Congress party. So we can say that not just the ruling party, but even the opposition parties had been influenced by this war, because it was such a time 1962, at that time a very big, great loss it was for the country. And this also led to our attention to the northeastern provinces of the country, because they were the areas of major vulnerable points of the country, because there the military confrontations were very much often, and that is why this turned the government's attention on the northeastern provinces of the country, such as Tripura, Manipur, which were union territories of the country, but now they had been given the right to elect their own legislative assemblies, and many other provinces were also given the political autonomy. Many other regions were given political unity of the country as well, because it was important, or else there could be another situation that could rise up in that region, and that's why it was important to have political administration over the northeastern part of the country. Now, after the relation with China, now let's discuss about the conflict and peace with Pakistan, which is the next topic. Wars and peace with Pakistan. Now, in the Chinese situation, we saw that in the starting phase there were good relations. Of course, they were between the Indian government and the Chinese government, but with Pakistan, even from the time of partition, there were conflicts. Why so? First was the conflict of Jammu and Kashmir. In 1947, when all the provinces, the princely states, were given the right to either part of the dominion of India, the dominion of Pakistan, or to remain independent. Now, Jammu and Kashmir was a critical point. Why so? Because there the population was majorly Muslims and the king was Hindu. The king was Raja Hari Singh, and Pakistan eagerly wanted it to be part of their country, and that is why they launched a proxy war in 1947 as well. It was not a full-fledged war, but a proxy war that happened between India and Pakistan, and later on it was resolved with the UN intervention. So we can say that even from the time of independence there were conflicts between India and Pakistan. Though there were military confrontation, but it didn't mean that we didn't try to establish peace with each other. There were some peaceful situations as well. For example, the Indus Water Treaty in 1960, which was done by the intervention, by the mediation of World Bank. Now, Indus Water Treaty was for the usage of the water of the river Indus, because it flowed from India to Pakistan. So India could stop the flow of that river by making large scale projects on the river. That is why Indus Water Treaty was done, and it has emerged as one of the most successful peaceful treaties in the world. So we can say that there were some situations. Next major conflicting situation was in 1965. Now, as you know that in 1962 India just had fought such a large scale war, and that is why the resources were kind of lacking in the country, and that's why in 1965 Pakistan saw its opportunity. Why? Because in 1965 India got the second prime minister, the new prime minister other than Jawaharlal Nehru, which was 𝓒𝓲𝓫𝓱𝓪. His government had just been formed, and that's the moment when Pakistan launched an attack on India. From the region of Rajasthan, from the region of Jammu and Kashmir, it launched attack on India in April, and then we had to counter-attack. Now, in that, the leadership of 𝓒𝓲𝓫𝓱𝓪 is admired by many people, because he launched a secretive attack from another frontier, which meant that from the region of Punjab he launched attack, because the main focus of the Pakistani armed forces was on the region of Jammu and Kashmir and on the region of Rajasthan. And taking that opportunity, the Indian armed forces launched attack on the Punjab frontier of the country, of the boundaries, and we even reached the region of Lahore in Pakistan, and the war was stopped in the victory of India by the intervention of the UN. And then the treaty, which was the Tashkent Agreement, was signed in USSR. Now, Tashkent Agreement in 1966 is considered one of the most controversial agreements, because after signing this agreement, the Prime Minister of India, who had just been formed in 1965, 𝓒𝓲𝓫𝓱𝓪, the second prime minister, died due to heart attack. So there were many controversies after the news of it that there must be some conspiracies or some kind of other secretive things, but it was said that he died due to heart attack. So we can say that in 1965, a full-fledged war between India and Pakistan happened, which turned in victory of India, though it was stopped with the intervention of the UN, because the work of the United Nations was to keep peaceful situation in the country after the world wars. So of course, with the intervention of UN, the Tashkent Agreement, which was mediated by the Soviet Union, was signed between the Pakistani General Ayub Khan and the Indian Prime Minister 𝓒𝓲𝓫𝓱𝓪. Now, the next major war was in 1971, which was the Bangladesh War 1971. Now, this is very important in this chapter. Why so? Because if you look at the geography of Pakistan before 1971, you would see that there were two Pakistans. One was the West Pakistan that we see today, and another was the East Pakistan that we see today as Bangladesh, as another country. Because when Pakistan and India were distributed, where the partition happened, Pakistan was given provinces in the western part as well as in the eastern part of the country. But what happened that there were many differences between the West Pakistan and the East Pakistan. First was the division in the Muslim religion, in the Islamic religion, which of the Shia Muslims and Sunni Muslims. Another was of the language, which turned to be major, because in the West Pakistan, people spoke majorly the Urdu language, while in the Eastern Pakistan, people spoke Bengali language, because it was partitioned from the Bengal province of our country, and that's why we call West Bengal, even though it's in the east part of the country. Why? Because it was partitioned, and the eastern part of that Bengal province got to be another country, which was West Pakistan at that time. So we can say that there were many differences between the West Pakistan and the East Pakistan, and it turned to be major difference in 1970. Why? Because in 1970 the outcome of the general elections came up, and there were two verdicts. The first was of 𝓥𝓲𝓫𝓱𝓪 Bhutto, whom the Western Pakistan, which was the major administrative agency, the major administrative area was in the West Pakistan, so they wanted him to be the prime minister, while the verdict came in the favor of Awami League in the East Pakistan, and their leader was Sheikh Mujib-ur-Rahman. Now this Sheikh Mujib-ur-Rahman was very much popular, very much well known in the East Pakistan, and that was the point which was not accepted by the West Pakistan. Why? Because they wanted 𝓥𝓲𝓫𝓱𝓪 Bhutto to be the prime minister of the whole Pakistan, and that is why many conflicts and tensions came up. Many public protests also came up, and that is why a lot of refugees came in India, because they were being suppressed by the forces of West Pakistan, and that is why they had to take refuge in India. And you know what? At that time, over 80 lakh refugees came in India, mostly in the state of West Bengal, because they didn't have any place to go. So they crossed boundaries and came to West Bengal. Of course, India could also not have so much people. India could also not accommodate so many people at the same time, and that is why India had to intervene. Pakistan also came up saying that India was promoting anti-Pakistani conflicts, but India nonetheless intervened, and a war broke out in 1971. Now in 1971, the prime minister of our country was Indira Gandhi, who was a very well-known personality at that time as well, the first woman prime minister of our country. In December 1971, the war broke out between India and Pakistan. Now before going to the war, you should know about the Axis as well. Pakistan had support from the US and China. There was an axis which was formed of US, China and Pakistan. So of course India just could not sit down, and that is why just before the war broke out, India had signed an agreement with Soviet Union for 20 years that if in the upcoming time India faces attack, that it would get support from the Soviet Union. So we can say that due to the formation of axis of Pakistan, US and China, India had to sign the agreement with Soviet Union. So we can say that at that time the balancing act of the non-alignment was disrupted a lot, because we did not have any other choice. At that time India just had fought war in 1965, so of course another military confrontation, it had to have so many resources, military equipments, defense requirements, and that is why it needed support. It could not go against US by itself. And that's another proof that Axis was formed, was that when the US president, which was Mr. Nixon, came to China via Pakistan. So we can say that the Axis formed, and we also formed the Axis with Soviet Union. So finally in December 1971, the war broke out between India and Pakistan, which turned in favor of India. You know that if you look closely, if you look deeply in depth in the war, you would see that just before the war was ended, the US forces was about to reach in India, but before they could reach India, the war broke out. The war was stopped with the surrender of the Pakistani forces, and then a new country, which was Bangladesh, was formed. Bangladesh, which means that Bangla, the language, and Desh in Hindi means the country. So it was a country for the people who speak Bengali language. So when the country is formed, and one of the reasons why India won that war, India got victory in that war, was the popular support. Because when India reached the province of the frontier of East Pakistan, there it got a lot of popular support, which the Pakistani forces lacked a lot. Even in 1965, when they launched attack in India, they were expecting a kind of popular support in the region of Jammu and Kashmir, which they did not get, and that is why they lost the war. But India got a lot of popular support because they were fighting for the cause of the Bangladeshis. So we can say that India got victory in that war, and that led to national jubilation in the country, with the formation of new country, with a new neighbor, with peaceful negotiations. Then we can say that it was a moment of national jubilation when people could see the increased military prowess of our country. The military power of the country had risen up, and people could see that. But there were some disadvantages as well. What were the disadvantages? If you remember the last chapter, we studied about the 5-year plans, and after the third 5-year plan, there were economic crisis in the country. Why? Because a lot of our revenue, a lot of our money went to the military requirements, went to the military expenditure. So country's development was very hard because we spent a lot on the military requirements. New departments such as Department of Defense Supplies, Department of Defense Production were set up, and that is why a lot of expenditure was spent on them. And that is why after the third 5-year plan, we had to adopt annual year plans. Then the next 5-year plan, which was the fourth 5-year plan, was started in 1969 after taking a planned holiday from 1966 to 1969. The reason was this: because of the wars in 1962 and even in 1964, there were some small scale attacks launched by China. So in 1962, 1965 and 1971, of course, we had to spend a lot to get victory in 1965 and 1970 war. And in 1965, we lost our prime ministers. Of course, that was also a moment of sadness in the country. So for facing those situations, of course, there would be economic crisis in the country, and that's what India faced. Now the next topic here is India's nuclear policy. So India's nuclear policy. Now till now we have seen India's stand in the international politics, and we have also seen our relations with the neighbors, China and Pakistan. Now let's see the nuclear policy of our country, because that's also important. You know that in 1964, the communist China conducted the first nuclear tests ever in their country, and then they became China and other countries that were UK, USSR, US, France and China. These 5 countries, which were also the permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, were the only 5 countries which were the nuclear powers. And so in 1968, the Non-Proliferation Treaty was imposed, which had many restrictions on the use of nuclear energy by other countries. Now, this treaty was considered as discriminatory by the Indian government. The Indian leaders considered it as a kind of proof for the legitimized use and the monopoly of these 5 countries over the nuclear energy, and that is why India never signed this treaty. Even the comprehensive Benn Treaty test was not signed by India. And in 1974, in May 1974, the first nuclear tests of the country was conducted under the Prime Minister Indira Gandhi. Now, it was conducted in Pokhran region of Rajasthan and it was codenamed as Smiling Buddha. So we can say that the first nuclear tests of the country were conducted in 1974. Now, the point you need to remember is that India eagerly promoted the peaceful use of nuclear energy. Even before the Non-Proliferation Treaty of 1968, India had advocated peaceful uses of nuclear energy. But after that, in 1968, when it was kind of monopoly, when the nuclear power was being monopolized by the 5 countries, India opposed this, because not just these powerful countries had the right to use the nuclear powers. So that's why in 1974, the first nuclear tests were conducted by the country. Now, these tests were condemned by the world. Many countries opposed this. Even the US, the UN, many other countries opposed this, and many international organizations as well. Why? Because the international organizations are very much controlled by the superpowers, and that's why they opposed the tests of India. The second nuclear tests were conducted in 1998 under the Prime Minister 𝓒𝓲𝓫𝓱𝓪 in the same region of Pokhran. Now, those tests were not that much condemned. Why? Because the political situation, the economic situation of the country, the global background of the country had improved a lot since 1974. Now, the countries, the global world was seeing India as a strategic partner, and that's why the condemnation was not that much. Only Pakistan and China came up. Following India, Pakistan also conducted its tests, the nuclear tests. And you know what? That in 1999, there was a Kargil war between India and Pakistan. Now, it was seen as a moment of great chaos because the world predicted that they could use nuclear energy, nuclear bombs on each other, because just a year before, in 1998, both countries had conducted nuclear tests. So it could be a moment of a great war. However, that did not happen. Kargil war, which happened due to secretive attacks of Pakistan in the Kargil region of Jammu and Kashmir. So we can say that India adopted nuclear tests, India adopted nuclear energy, nuclear bombs only for the peaceful use. Even the theory, the main deterrence of the nuclear use is no first use. That is, India will never use nuclear energy firstly, only in the case of subjugation, only in the case of no other choice, then India will choose nuclear energy. So India's policy is no first use, which it has been advocating for a long time. So we can say that if we talk about the nuclear policy, it has evolved a lot. From 1974 to now, 2024, it has evolved a lot. And not just India, many other countries have included the nuclear energy, nuclear tests. So we can say nuclear policy, India is one of the countries which did not sign the Non-Proliferation Treaty and the Comprehensive Benn Treaty test, which was started in 1968. Now, the next and last topic of this chapter is shifting alliances in world politics. Now, we have seen that India adopted a non-alignment movement, but after that, before the 1970 war, India had a tilt towards the pro-Soviet Union. And what about now? Because India would not stand in the same place as it was standing in 1950s and 60s. It has improved a lot. It has changed a lot. Why so? Because in 1991 you already know about the disintegration of the Soviet Union, and the major country was Russia. Even though it still has a lot of power, but it had lost its preeminence during the time of Cold War, and that is why India adopted a lot of pro-US relation as well, a pro-US policy as well. After the period of 1977, as you know that in 1975 emergency was imposed, and that is why the Congress was disrupted a lot, and after 1990s many coalitions came up in country. So the government of the Indian National Congress was weakened a lot. You will study about this in the coming chapters of this book as well. Due to that, many opposition parties came to form the government of the country, and they had initiated other types of policies as well. Even though we had maintained non-aligned, but now we are more focused on US strategy as well, and today we are balancing between Russia and US as well. You know that at the time of nuclear test in 1974, many sanctions were imposed on India because we had conducted nuclear tests, but now we are having good strategic relation with the US and Russia. Why? Because at present we are more keen on economic development rather than on military confrontation, and always the relation between the countries are based on national interest rather than on friendship, rather than the emotional attachment or the past. We are more focused on the national interest of the country, and seeing the national interest, you could see that US became a superpower. So we can say that is why we are having a good strategic relation with the US. Even the sanctions were later on, and we are having a balanced act with Russia as well. If you look at the Russia-Ukraine war, you would see that India maintained its stand. It opposed the war, but it didn't oppose Russia. So we can say that India is still, because from the time of independence, India has grown a lot. It has become in the top 5 GDPs of the world, and has grown a lot, become a very important role it is playing in the world politics, and that is why it is seen as a very good partner. We are also maintaining the relation with China. We are having like mutual relations. We would not say that it is very good. And with Pakistan, you are seeing the situation as from the time to time there are conflicts, but not to the edge of the war. We are having conflict between the politicians of the country, but that doesn't mean we are having a war. The last war was in 1999, and after that there have been strikes, surgical strikes like in Uri, the Pulwama attacks. There have been conflicts and tensions, but we would not say that they were full-fledged war. So that is all we have discussed in this chapter. In this chapter, firstly, we saw the international context in which we saw about the Second World War, the emergence of communist China. Then we saw that the British, when they left India, they had left a lot of impact and influence on India in the international politics. So we had to improve that as well in the foreign policy of the country. Then we also saw about relations with China and with Pakistan, the wars in 1962, 1965 and in 1971, the nuclear policy of the country, and what we are in the present. So that's all we have discussed. I've covered all the topics and subtopics, and the next chapters of this book will be covered in the further upcoming videos. So stay tuned for upcoming videos. Thank you very much.